Welcome, welcome, all my Tech-Mexers. Here we are, gathered together at the dawning of a new year, and that means it's finally time to look back at the year in review. That's right, it's finally time for another Top 10 list, and this is the Top 10 Books of 2024. For clarification, most of these books did not come out last year. That's just the year in which I read them. So let's get into it, baby.
Oh, he's technically Mexican and 3/4 American, but for 3 generations he's got that nationality. Great-great-grandpa headed south, whose kids had kids then turned around. It's not what the show's about, but it's why he's Mexican technically. It helps that he was raised in New Mexico, lived in Guadalajara for 2 years, speaks fluent Spanish with a bachelor's degree in language, and makes a mean taquito.
In 2024, I read 35 books. Wow, that's a big number. Too shy of what I read last year. I've failed myself. I've failed my mother. I live in permanent shame. I didn't quite beat my record of 37 books. I even had to throw in a handful of novellas to pad those numbers.
I pump those numbers up. Those are rookie numbers in this racket.
But hey, if Wind and Truth only counts as one book, I can count novellas as separate books. Okay? Deal with it. Now, if you're a regular on the channel, these books probably won't come as a surprise to you because I've been doing regular book clubs, which I love doing.
You're in a book club?
And I also bring up the books that I've been reading on the weekly live stream, Best Gen, where I talk about everything pop culture. So if you've been paying attention, you know what books I've read, but you don't know what order I've put them in. So without further ado, we start with number 10. Fire and Blood by George R.R. Martin. I really liked this book. In fact, it's the only book from the author that I've read. I have not read A Song of Ice and Fire. I have not read A Game of Thrones. But I really enjoyed House of the Dragon, and I wanted to check out the source material. And I was really surprised with Fire and Blood. It was a very enjoyable read, despite reading like a textbook, because that's what it is. It's a history book of Westeros. And on top of that, it is a prequel to the main series. But it was incredibly engaging. It was a really well-written history book covering a section of history that was really exciting. On that same vein, I also read J.R.R. Tolkien's The Silmarillion this year, and I loved it, but I actually liked Fire and Blood better.
Right to jail, right away.
So The Silmarillion does not make my top 10 list this year. I also think Fire and Blood is a book that you can enjoy whether or not you've watched any of the series. It's obviously more rewarding if you have, but it also stands on its own. So now we move on up to number 9. A book which I also read for the same purpose as Fire and Blood so that I could judge the TV show. The Three-Body Problem, written by Xijing Liu, is the first book in the trilogy of books entitled A Memory of Earth's Past, and recently turned into a TV series on Netflix called Three-Body Problem, made by those guys that ruined Game of Thrones.
Dany kind of forgot about the Iron Fleet and Euron's forces.
She forgot?
She forgot.
Dany kind of forgot about the Iron Fleet.
I absolutely loved the book. It's fantastic. It is a great piece of sci-fi, and the TV show wasn't great. I wanted to love it. There are things that I did like about it, and there are some horrible, horrible changes that were made that just contradict the purpose of the book, which was quite frustrating. But I highly recommend the book. It was a fantastic read. And that's all I have to say about that one. So continuing the trend of books I read so that I can be judgy is number 8 on the list. Best Served Cold by Joe Abercrombie. This book is currently being adapted into a movie that I'm looking forward to seeing. No real news yet on when that's going to be released, but the main character is going to be played by Rebecca Ferguson, which is nice. So really looking forward to that adaptation, and I really enjoyed the book. It was really well written. I haven't gone very deep into Joe Abercrombie's books. I've only read the First Law trilogy, which was fantastic and horribly depressing. I highly recommend those books if you hate yourself.
I do.
And Best Served Cold is also very dark in that same vein, but it's also significantly more lighthearted. It's still very dark, but it also has a lot of fun, which is probably a great place to start an adaptation. I think it'll be an interesting place for people to be introduced to that world. Although, depending on how they handle certain events in this book, you could massively spoil First Law. So I don't know if I'd recommend reading it first, but I think they could get away with making the movie first. It was a good book, and it didn't make me as sad as First Law did. Just a little bit sad. So moving on to number 7. Number 7, a book that was recommended to me by Bryce from the YouTube channel Shelf Centered, you should check him out, is Heroes Die by Matthew Woodring Stover. This is the first book in the Acts of Cain series, and it was really fun. It was published in the 90s, and it's very 90s. It's campy in all of the best ways, but it's also just straight up awesome in all of those best ways too. It's also a fun blend of fantasy and sci-fi. It's technically a sci-fi book, but reads like a fantasy because it uses sci-fi to have the plot take place in a fantasy world, which is really fun. It's got a great traditional hero as the protagonist, which is incredibly refreshing to read, especially now in the modern world that just loves to deconstruct heroism and ruin everything. But anyway, Heroes Die was fantastic. Let's move on to number 6. Lost Boys by Orson Scott Card. This book destroyed me. It was devastatingly beautiful. I loved every second, and it broke my heart. It is a beautiful piece of fiction. It's also mostly not a fantasy or a sci-fi. It's mostly just fiction set in our real world with a few small fantastical elements. It is part murder mystery, part horror, part slice of life. It's an incredibly unique piece of fiction, and I really, really liked it. It's also a very religious forward book, but it's not preachy in any way. The main characters are very religious, but that's not what the story is about. The book is about their family dynamic, their family drama, and an overlooming threat that hangs above them the entire story. It's really, really smart how this book is written, and the ending is just so good.
Cried like a baby, a hungry, angry baby.
I recommend it. It's very good. It's actually kind of shocking how low this one is on my list. I read a lot of good books this year. So that's it. We're through the bottom 5 of the top 10. All great books, just not quite as good as the top 5 books I read in 2024. Number 5. Carl's Doomsday Scenario by Matt Dinniman. This is the second book in the Dungeon Crawler Carl series. Number 4. Dungeon Crawler Carl. That's right, 2 books from the same series in my top 5. They were really good. But moving on to number 3, we have The Gate of the Feral Gods by Matt Dinniman. I loved every page, but it wasn't quite as good as number 2, The Dungeon Anarchist's Cookbook by Matt Dinniman, book 3 in the Dungeon Crawler Carl series. This book blew the other 3 books out of the water. It was an 11 out of 10, but was beaten out at the last minute by my number 1 pick, my favorite book of 2024, The Butcher's Masquerade by Matt Dinniman, book number 5 in the Dungeon Crawler Carl series. I thought book 3 was a perfect book, and then I read book 5. It is a 13 out of 10. The Butcher's Masquerade is absolutely phenomenal. It is a masterpiece. I loved every second. This book just never stopped. When I picked up this series, I was not ready for what it would do to my life. I thought it was going to be a fun comedy with lots of funny violence, which it is, but I wasn't also expecting to be completely emotionally moved by the series. I have cried so many times while reading Dungeon Crawler Carl.
Dude, you're embarrassing me in front of the wizards.
And that is insane. It is a ridiculous premise propped up by ridiculous set pieces. I mean, the main character is running around in his boxers the whole time, and his companion throughout the series is a talking princess cat diva. It's ridiculous. It's very funny, and it's one of the best written books of all time. It's a masterpiece. Matt Dinniman somehow managed to contort this comedy into one of the most poignant and beautiful series of books ever. They're great. You should definitely read Dungeon Crawler Carl. They're not very family friendly, but they're a lot of fun. But I obviously joke a little bit. I can't let Dungeon Crawler Carl ruin my top 10 list. So I'm forced to combine the first 5 books, which are the only ones I've read so far, into one entry on my top 10 list. And it definitely doesn't deserve number 5. So we'll come back to Dungeon Crawler Carl later. The real number 5 on my top 10 list of 2024 is Heretics of Dune by Frank Herbert. This book is wonderful. It's fantastic. I really enjoyed Heretics of Dune. In fact, the entire time I was reading it, I couldn't figure out if I liked it more than God Emperor of Dune, which until now was the best Dune book. And I still think God Emperor of Dune is the best, but it's really, really close. Heretics of Dune just loses by a fraction of a hair because it's not quite as poignant as God Emperor of Dune, but it's really good and it gets number 5. It's a fantastic piece of sci-fi. There was a shockingly high number of sci-fi on my top 10 list because I read mostly fantasy, but it is what it is and I'm not going to lie. Moving on to number 4. Is Shadow of the Conqueror by Shad Brooks. This was actually the first book that I read in 2024, and I thought for sure this would be number 1 on my list this year. I loved it so much. But alas, it wouldn't be because I just happened to have read some really good books this year. Shadow of the Conqueror is an incredibly interesting fantasy book that just has an amazing premise. This book is an experiment to see if it's possible to redeem a fundamentally unredeemable person, and it's a really beautiful story. I really loved Shadow of the Conqueror. It's a fantastic book, and I think everyone should read it. It has a lot of really interesting things to say about morality and good and evil, but there are some really good set pieces in this book that make it fun and poignant at the same time. I loved this book. So moving on to number 3, I'm putting the entire Dungeon Crawler Carl series. We already talked about it. I loved it. It's fantastic. It gets number 3 on my top 10 list because we have to move on to number 2. My second favorite book of 2024, possibly one of the greatest books of all time, Hyperion by Dan Simmons. Another friggin' sci-fi book. I hate it. This book is a masterpiece. It is absolutely incredible. It's a 10 out of 10. I have no complaints. It's the Canterbury Tales, but in space, and it's phenomenal. And you should read Hyperion. I also read the sequel, The Fall of Hyperion, which finishes up the story that Hyperion introduces, and it was almost as good, but not quite, so Hyperion gets the number 2 slot on my list. So we're almost there, but before we get to number 1, there are a few honorable mentions of some other books that I read this year that were really good, but didn't quite make the top 10 list. I really liked Wool by Hugh Howey, which is the first book in the Silo series, which has been adapted on Apple TV. It's a really fun series, and it's a really good book. I think the Silo TV show is almost a perfect adaptation, which is rare to see these days because modern Hollywood loves to just completely destroy books in their adaptations. I also read Stormfront by Jim Butcher, which is the first book in the Dresden Files series. It was a lot of fun. It was a great book. It just didn't quite make the list. I read Pyramids and The Hogfather by Terry Pratchett, which are part of his Discworld series, which I loved. They were great books. Didn't quite make the list, but they deserve a mention. And now I have a couple dishonorable mentions. Books that I thought for sure I was going to love and then didn't. First, I have to mention The Silence of Unworthy Gods by Andrew Rowe. This is the fourth book in the Arcane Ascension series, which I've been really loving. And I also loved the majority of this book. In fact, the ending of this book is probably the best of the entire series. It's phenomenal, and I wanted to love this book, but for some reason there are some bizarre choices that happen in the middle. I've already pre-ordered book 5, and I look forward to reading it, and I hope it doesn't have the same problems as book 4. But for some reason, Andrew Rowe really let his politics shine through in this book. And I always try to separate the art from the artist. I have no problem reading books or even being friends with people I disagree with politically. But there are some times when adherence to certain dogmas just ruin storytelling, and that absolutely happened in this book. The plot of this book just stops right in the middle so that the characters can make posters for a Black Lives Matter protest. It's bizarre, and it completely pulled me out of the story. And obviously it wasn't a Black Lives Matter protest specifically. It was some in-world equivalent, but that's obviously what it was referring to, and it was just awful. I was not expecting it at all, and it really ruined the book for me. But not nearly as much as the most dishonorable mention of the year, which, in the most shocking turn of events, is Wind and Truth by Brandon Sanderson. I am a Sanderson sycophant. I am a Sander simp. I have read and loved all of his books. I recommend Sanderson to everyone. And Stormlight Archive was supposed to be his magnum opus. In fact, I had this to say about book 5 last year. I'm pumped, I'm ready, I'm caught up, I'm ready for Stormlight Book 5. You can pretty much just expect that to be really high up on my list in 2024, okay?
I haven't aged well.
I was absolutely sure that Wind and Truth would be number 1 on my top 10 list. But not only did it not make my top 10 list, I hated it. It was the worst book I've read all year. It's the worst book I've read in a very long time. There is so much to go over about Wind and Truth that I have to make a separate video about it, because it does not work as a book, and it does not deliver on any of the promises that were set up for the Stormlight Archive. I have never been more disappointed in my life.
My disappointment is immeasurable, and my day is ruined.
But now, moving on, out of the darkness, we can finally reveal the number 1 book that I read in 2024. And if you've been paying at all attention to my channel, this will not come as a surprise. It is the only book on my list that is nonfiction. It is a biographical history book. It was written a really long time ago, and yet it has never been more relevant than today. This book explains everything. If you've ever wondered to yourself, why does everything suck right now? Why is Hollywood so disgustingly woke? And why are they pushing that agenda so hard and so far? This book has the answers to all of those questions and many, many more. My number 1 book of 2024 is not The Naked Communist by Cleon Skousen. It's the Book of Mormon, baby. Got him again, baby. I set up all the pins and I knocked them down, but in a way you weren't expecting. The Naked Communist is fantastic, and you absolutely should read it. But even more important than that book is the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon contains the answers to life, the universe, and everything. It is another testament of Jesus Christ, just like the Bible. While the Holy Bible details a history of God's people and prophets in the Old World, the Book of Mormon is a history of God's people and prophets in the New World. It was written specifically for our day. It's the best book that I read in 2024, and it's the best book of all time. I highly recommend it. And that's it. Those are the top 10 books that I read in 2024. It was an absolutely crazy year filled with some unexpected surprises and some very unexpected disappointments. But before we end this already very long video, I wanted to quickly highlight my most anticipated books of 2025. I really need to read more Discworld. I only read 2 Discworld books this year, and I feel bad because I want to read all of them. I also want to go back to making Discworld videos, and I will really try and do that this year. There's a bunch that I read now a year ago that I still haven't made videos on, but I'm going to read more than 2 Discworld books in 2025. A Crown of Swords, Book 7 in the Wheel of Time. I reread books 4 through 6 last year, and they were fantastic and would have made my top 10 list if they hadn't been disqualified by being rereads. I'm going to read the rest of the Silo books. Shift is number 2. Looking forward to it. I want to read The Dark Forest, which is book 2 in the 3 Body Problem series. I'm pretty sure the TV show was renewed for a second season, so it'll be relevant. I want to read more Dresden Files. Look forward to book clubs on those. It should be a lot of fun. I really need to get around to reading Elder Epic, which is the 3rd book in the Gunmetal God series, and I was supposed to read it last year and never got around to it. I'm so sorry, Zamil Akhtar. I really want to read that book, but I've been kind of busy. I'm really looking forward to reading Elegy of a Fragmented Vineyard by Kaden Love. I met a lot of independent authors at Dragonsteel this year, and I plan on reading a lot of their books, but this is the one that I'm most excited about. I had a booth right next to Kaden Love, and we talked a lot, and we're best friends now, so I have to read his book. And in that same vein, I need to read Dragon Hunter by Blake and Raven Penn, book 3 in the Skystone Chronicles. That one was released in the end of 2024, and I haven't read it yet because the audiobook is not out yet, and I am a filthy casual. I no longer have time to physically sit down and read a physical book. I have way too much on my plate. And penultimately, I'm really looking forward to reading the Ender's Shadow series. Reading Lost Boys reinvigorated my excitement to get back into Orson Scott Card's books. After having finally finished the Ender series a while back, which was phenomenal, I've been saying for a while that I need to read the Shadow series as well, and I'm going to do it this year. I already reread Ender's Game, and Ender's Shadow is going to be the first book I read in 2025, which will also be a reread, but I haven't read the rest of the books in that series. And then I can finish off the entire Enderverse by reading The Last Shadow, which came out just a few years ago, and it ties up both Ender's story and Bean's Ender's Shadow story. And the last book, the number 1 book I'm looking forward to in 2025, is This Inevitable Ruin, which is book 7 in the Dungeon Crawler Carl series. And like Dragon Hunter, the book has already been released, but we're still waiting on the audiobook, and I still have to read book 6. But I know it's going to be good, and I'm really looking forward to reading it. So that's it. We're finally done. 2025 is going to be crazy. It's going to be a lot of fun. I have a lot of things on my plate, and I hope you stick around and join me for the ride.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the video. If it's true, please take a minute to subscribe to the channel, and you can join us along for the ride. And if you pay me, I'll try to be more entertaining, so please consider joining Patreon and getting your name in the credits with pride.
I'd buy that for $1.